November 1943, Morro River Valley, Italy. Captain Ernst Weber pressed his back against the cold stone wall of the farmhouse, his breath forming short, freezing clouds in the bitter air. 3 of his men were dead. Not from mortars, not from machine gun bursts, simply gone. One moment they were alive, joking about letters from home, and the next they collapsed without warning. No sound, no flash, nothing until the bullet had already found them. Weber had been a soldier since the invasion of Poland in 1939. He knew the rhythm of battle, the noise, the chaos. But this was something entirely different, something he didn't have a name for. The first man died at dawn while lighting a cigarette near the observation post. The second collapsed 3 hours later, shot, while carrying ammunition across a stretch of ground that should have been completely safe, nearly 200 meters behind the front line. The third was Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann, a survivor of Stalingrad, who fell while looking through binoculars at Canadian positions across the valley. The bullet entered through his right eye. Weber later found the binoculars, one lens shattered and a thin crust of frozen blood on the metal frame. The shot had come from somewhere in the hills to the north, but Weber saw only fog and bare, skeletal trees. No flicker of light, no smoke, no silhouette. His remaining men refused to move now. 12 soldiers crowded in the farmhouse basement, rifles ready but effectively useless against an enemy they could not detect. Young Private Schneider, barely 18, kept murmuring the same word: witchcraft. Weber wanted to snap him out of it, but deep down he wasn't certain the boy was wrong. How else could this be explained? The Canadians were killing his men from distances that shouldn't have been possible, through weather conditions that ruined normal marksmanship, with accuracy that defied every rule of combat Weber had ever learned. Across the valley, lying motionless in a shallow dip, hidden among dead grapevines and scattered rocks, Sergeant Harold Marshall had not moved in 6 hours. The cold had stopped bothering him around the 3rd hour. That was normal. Growing up in Manitoba taught you to stop noticing cold or you froze. He had spent whole winters tracking wolves through forests where temperatures dropped to 40 below. Patience wasn't a skill. It was survival. Movement meant death. The hunter who shifted first usually lost. The German troops across the valley didn't understand that yet. But they would. Marshall was 32, practically an old man compared to most in his unit. Before the war, he guided hunting parties deep into the wilderness north of Lake Winnipeg. Wealthy sportsmen from New York and Toronto hired him to find moose and bear. Most of them were terrible hunters, too loud, too restless, firing at anything that vaguely resembled game. They expected animals to appear, simply because they wanted them to. Marshall watched them burn through ammunition on hopeless shots and then complain that the woods were empty. The woods were never empty. You just needed to know how to see, how to wait. When he joined the Canadian Army, nobody knew quite what to do with him. He wasn't a career soldier, and he didn't fit the standard mold. He marched awkwardly, avoided unnecessary conversation, and ignored the teasing from other sergeants who called him the quiet Indian guide from the frozen north, even though he was white and had never claimed anything else. But Marshall had learned to track from Cree hunters who worked the trap lines near his cabin. He understood wind, terrain, camouflage. He knew how to fade into the landscape. Then someone handed him a rifle and told him to shoot. Marshall placed 5 rounds through the center of a target at 400 meters. The range officer chalked it up to luck, until he repeated it flawlessly. He didn't miss, not because he was magically gifted, though he had natural ability, but because he followed a rule he'd lived by his whole life. Never fire unless you're absolutely certain. Ammunition in the wilderness was heavy and expensive. You didn't waste bullets. You waited, then made the shot count. The British had small sniper programs. The Americans barely understood what a sniper was supposed to do. Most officers saw sniping as extra work for scouts, not a strategic weapon. When Marshall suggested using snipers not just for reconnaissance, but to cripple morale, to create fear, his commander laughed. Why invest hours in killing one man when artillery could kill 20? Why sit still all day for one shot when machine guns fired 100 rounds in minutes? Marshall tried explaining. Artillery was loud, machine guns were louder, and the enemy knew where they came from. But a silent rifle, a single perfect shot from nowhere, and then total disappearance. That created a different kind of fear. Not fear of dying, but fear of the unknown. Soldiers changed how they behaved. They hesitated. They slowed down. They became easier targets for everyone else. Most officers dismissed him, except Lieutenant General Guy Simons. Simons commanded Canadian forces in Italy and understood something crucial. This war would be won by adaptation. The Germans were fortified in positions too strong to break with conventional assaults. Casualties were mounting. Traditional tactics were failing. Something needed to change. So Simons gave Marshall permission to try. He authorized the creation of specialized sniper sections trained in extreme patience and long-range precision. He issued modified Ross rifles, old WODY weapons, but capable of exceptional accuracy. He allowed Marshall to select his own men, hunters, trappers, farm boys who understood quiet. 6 hours into his wait, Marshall finally saw movement. A German officer stepped briefly into a farmhouse window, checking on his men. The distance was nearly 780 meters, through fog, through freezing distortion, a shot no sane marksman would attempt. Marshall exhaled, settled his heartbeat, read the wind through the drifting fog, and squeezed the trigger. The officer fell instantly. Marshall didn't watch. He was already retreating, sliding backward through vines and frozen earth. Rule 1 of sniping: one shot, then vanish. Never fire twice from the same place. Never give the enemy a chance to find you. He crawled 30 meters before standing and walking calmly toward Canadian lines as if strolling home. Back at the Canadian forward position, Marshall methodically cleaned his rifle while his spotter, Private Tommy Chen from Vancouver, entered the details into their logbook. Distance 780 meters. Weather: heavy morning fog, light northwest wind. Outcome: confirmed kill enemy officer. Time on target: 6 hours and 12 minutes. The logbook had been Marshall's idea. Every shot required documentation, precise measurements, weather notes, and corrections. This wasn't guesswork. It was a blend of science and instinct. You had to track what worked and what didn't, so new snipers could be trained to replicate those results. The rifle Marshall used was a Ross Mark III, a weapon despised by many Canadian soldiers. During the First World War, the Ross rifle had earned a notorious reputation for jamming in muddy trenches. Men had died because their rifles failed them. After that disaster, the army switched to the British Lee Enfield, and the Ross became a symbol of failed equipment. But Marshall knew something few appreciated. The Ross, in clean conditions, was extraordinarily accurate at long ranges. Its straight pull bolt action was smoother than the Lee Enfield, and in the hands of someone who understood it, the Ross could deliver precision few rifles in the world could match. Marshall took the rifle even further. He tuned the trigger pull to exactly 3 pounds. He hand-loaded his ammunition, measuring each powder charge to the grain to ensure every bullet left the barrel at the same speed. He mounted a 3.5 Bax Canadian-made optical sight and spent hours adjusting it until the crosshairs matched perfectly at 800 meters. Other soldiers thought he was obsessive, wasting afternoons firing at distant rocks and scribbling in his notebook. But Marshall knew that accuracy didn't happen by accident. In the wilderness, the difference between bringing home meat and going hungry often came down to tiny details that amateurs never noticed. Wind was the most difficult factor. At extreme distances, wind pushed a bullet dramatically off course. A bullet traveling 800 meters remained airborne long enough for the wind to shift its path several feet. Marshall learned to read wind by watching the way fog drifted, how grass trembled along hillsides, how snow curled around stones. He kept wind charts for each location: Italian valleys, French farmland, Dutch lowlands, each with its own atmospheric quirks. Military manuals barely addressed this level of detail, but Marshall treated it like gospel. Yet the most transformative concept he introduced was what he called the patience doctrine. Normal soldiers, trained by instinct and drill, shot as soon as they identified a target. That's what their training demanded: speed, aggression, decisive action. But Marshall taught his snipers something entirely different. You found an ideal position with clean fields of fire. You camouflaged yourself perfectly, and then you waited. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes for a day, sometimes for several days. You became part of the earth. You didn't move. You barely breathed. And when, and only when, the ideal target appeared under ideal conditions, you fired a single shot. It was a technique learned from hunting wolves. Wolves sensed movement instantly. If they spotted you, they vanished into the trees and you'd never see them again. You couldn't chase them. You had to find their paths, study their habits, and wait silently. Sometimes you waited an entire day, sometimes 3. But when a wolf finally appeared, relaxed because it believed nothing was watching, that was your moment. One bullet, one opportunity, and then the pack changed its behavior for months. Marshall wanted the Germans to feel the same way, to fear every gap between buildings, every window, every open doorway. He wanted them to understand that death could come from anywhere at any time, without warning or sound. Not everyone supported this approach. Major Richard Thompson, Marshall's battalion commander, hated the whole idea. Thompson was as a traditional officer, a believer in massed firepower and textbook infantry tactics, artillery barrages followed by infantry rushes. When he looked at Marshall's logbook, he saw 1 kill per day, sometimes a kill every 2 days. Meanwhile, a machine gun team might take down dozens. Artillery could destroy entire positions. Why waste trained soldiers on such inefficient work? Marshall tried explaining the psychological effect, but Thompson didn't buy it. Artillery frightened men for minutes. Machine guns terrified them while bullets flew. But snipers changed behavior permanently. A soldier hit by a sniper meant every window could be death. Every movement might be fatal. A sniper created constant tension, and tension broke units faster than explosives. The argument climbed the chain of command until it reached Lieutenant General Simons. Simons reviewed captured German intelligence reports. They told a startling story. German units facing Canadian sectors requested transfers. Officers noted discipline breakdowns, hesitation to man observation posts, refusal to walk near windows, reluctance to patrol. Some units refused nighttime movements without direct orders. Simons smiled as he read. The sniper program stayed and expanded. Every Canadian battalion would now include trained sniper sections. They would receive priority equipment, ammunition, and specialized training. Thompson was furious, but he couldn't overrule Simons. The real vindication arrived during the Battle of Ortona in December 1943. The town was a labyrinth of stone buildings and tight streets, ideal for German defenders. Canadian infantry suffered horrific casualties, clearing houses one by one. Marshall's 3-man sniper section climbed into a church bell tower overlooking the main square. For 16 hours, they controlled everything. Any German who tried to cross the square died. Anyone who leaned from a window died. The Germans couldn't advance or retreat. They were trapped by 3 men with rifles. A captured German lieutenant later confessed that his company refused to enter the street because of the ghost in the tower. They never saw the shooter. They never heard the shots. Men simply crumpled. Some swore Canadians had invented invisible bullets. Others believed the Canadians were using a new secret weapon. A few whispered it was magic. By spring 1944, German intelligence gathered increasingly bizarre reports. Officers noticed something alarming. In British sectors, officer casualties made up roughly 12% of combat deaths. In American sectors, about 15%. But in Canadian sectors, officer losses soared to nearly 38%. Even stranger, most casualties occurred beyond 600 meters, distances almost unheard of in standard infantry combat. Reports described the phenomenon as an anomaly needing investigation. German units rotated into Canadian-facing sectors adopted new behaviors quickly. Soldiers refused to stand upright, even far behind the front. They avoided using binoculars near windows. Helmets stayed on even while sleeping. Patrol numbers dropped by half. Some units simply refused to perform reconnaissance unless ordered at gunpoint. One captured German private near Casino told a story that sounded impossible. His squad had been pinned inside a farmhouse by a single Canadian shooter they never saw. The sniper killed their sergeant through fog so thick visibility was under 50 meters. Hours later, another man fell while trying to reach their radio. In the afternoon, their corporal died while hiding behind a stone wall that should have shielded him completely. The private insisted the bullet had bent around the wall. Impossible, but he had watched his corporal collapse and couldn't explain it any other way. The effect on morale was exactly what Marshall predicted. German troops in Canadian sectors imagined snipers everywhere, even where none existed. They fired at shadows, they wasted ammunition on bushes, they reported phantom sniper nests. Fear spread like infection. Fresh replacements arrived already terrified because veterans had filled their heads with stories about the Canadian ghosts who killed from unthinkable ranges, through fog, through stone, through anything. The weather only amplified the horror. Italian winters brought heavy morning fog that rolled through the valleys like a living thing, turning everything into a grey blur where even your own hands vanished in front of you. German soldiers knew that somewhere inside that fog, Canadian snipers were lying still as stone, watching and calculating. The fog would suddenly lift in patches like a curtain pulled aside, and in that fleeting moment of clarity, someone might die. A Lanzer named Otto Becker wrote in his diary about the morning routine in his unit. No one moved until the fog fully cleared. No one peeked out windows. No one dared to smoke or make coffee near openings. They sat in cold silence until the sun burned away the mist, and even then they moved quickly, bent low, trusting nothing. By the summer of 1944, when Canadian troops shifted to France for the Normandy campaign, their reputation had already reached German ears. Units ordered to face Canadian sectors braced themselves mentally. Divisional commanders requested additional counter-sniper teams. Some German formations even tried to create their own long-distance shooting schools, hoping to emulate Canadian methods. But the German approach was fundamentally different. Their snipers were taught to fire multiple rounds, maintain pressure, and dominate enemy lines. Aggressive hunters who wanted to control the battlefield. Canadian snipers were something else entirely. They were ambush predators. They waited. They blended. They struck once, then vanished. Numbers from the front told the story clearly. German snipers in Normandy often fired 15 to 20 shots a day. Canadian snipers typically fired between 1 and 3, but while Germans revealed themselves quickly and were often killed within 24 hours of deployment, Canadian snipers operated for weeks, even months, without being spotted. A single Canadian sniper team could lock down several square kilometers of terrain, shutting down entire roads and forcing German units to move only under cover of darkness. One such Canadian sniper, Corporal James Wallace, became a whispered legend. Wallace was a farm kid from Saskatchewan who had spent his childhood shooting gophers from impossible distances. By the time he turned 12, he could hit the head of a small animal from hundreds of yards away. He had the eyesight of a hawk and hands steady enough to hold a rifle motionless for minutes. During the fighting in Normandy, near the village of Norbisa, he saw a German artillery observer inside a church steeple nearly 850 meters away. The observer was directing devastating fire onto Canadian positions. Every few minutes another shell landed, killing men. The steeple opening was tiny, maybe 40 centimeters wide, and partially blocked by stone debris. The observer appeared only in quick flashes while adjusting his binoculars. Wallace waited for 40 minutes without shifting his position. The sky was overcast, the wind unpredictable, shifting directions every few minutes. The shot bordered on absurd. Yet when the observer leaned out again, Wallace fired. The bullet flew almost a full kilometer, rising and dropping in a perfect arc, nudged left by the wind, then right again as the gusts shifted, before slipping through the narrow opening and striking the observer squarely in the chest. German reports later noted the death with confusion. Range unknown, cause unknown. Shot described as impossible. The Germans tried desperately to counter the Canadian snipers. They brought in experienced marksmen from the Eastern Front, men hardened by years of brutal Russian warfare. They gave them superior optics, high-quality rifles, and priority access to ammunition. They built complex hideouts with multiple firing slits and escape tunnels. But none of it mattered. Canadian snipers possessed the one quality the German army could not manufacture: inhuman patience. A German sniper could wait 3 hours. A Canadian sniper would wait 3 days. German snipers were graded on daily results. Canadian snipers ignored numbers entirely. They fired only when the shot justified the risk. This mismatch led frustrated German counter-snipers to reveal themselves out of impatience, firing prematurely. And once they did, a Canadian sniper was waiting. Many German counter-snipers never lasted 24 hours. The myth only grew. Stories circulated among German troops, stories that became exaggerated with each retelling. They claimed Canadian snipers could hit targets through stone walls, see in total darkness, or kill without making a sound. Some said these shooters had supernatural abilities learned from mysterious tribes of the far north. Others blamed experimental British technology, rifles guided by radios or magnets. A few whispered drunken tales of Canadians making pacts with spirits in ancient forests, trading their souls for unholy accuracy. The truth was both simpler and far more terrifying. Canadian snipers were ordinary men using ordinary rifles. They followed physics, not magic. But they had elevated their skill to a level so precise it seemed impossible to those on the receiving end. They had turned waiting into a weapon sharper than any blade. They had transformed stillness into invisibility. They had become the embodiment of fear itself. As the war progressed, the reports became almost surreal. German diaries from the French hedgerows described soldiers who refused to stand upright even inside barns. Units crawled between buildings instead of walking. Men stopped looking through binoculars entirely, convinced that the moment they raised them, a Canadian bullet would travel through the lens into their eyes. Canadian snipers had reshaped the behavior of entire battalions. By the time summer 1944 arrived, Canadian forces had moved deeper into France, carrying their growing reputation with them. German formations assigned to Canadian sectors reacted with dread. They requested additional counter-sniper squads, asked for specialized equipment, and even attempted to train long-range marksmen of their own. But the problem couldn't be solved with equipment alone. The German sniper doctrine simply didn't match what the Canadians were doing. German snipers were aggressive, multiple shots, sustained pressure, constant interference with enemy movement. Canadian snipers were the opposite, invisible ambush predators who waited for the single perfect moment. The difference was obvious in the casualty reports. German snipers might fire dozens of rounds a day, but their firing positions were quickly identified and destroyed. Canadian snipers fired so rarely and from such unpredictable locations that they often stayed active for weeks without being detected. A single Canadian team could shut down entire avenues of movement, forcing German troops to alter their routes, crawl instead of walk, and travel only at night. The stories coming out of Normandy fed the growing legend. German soldiers insisted that Canadians were using some kind of advanced equipment unseen on other fronts. Others whispered that the Canadians had ghost-like abilities learned from hunters in the frozen wilderness. The myths grew more dramatic as fear spread. Some German soldiers claimed Canadian bullets curved in mid-air. Others believed Canadian snipers could see through walls. A few swore the shooters had supernatural senses, able to hear footsteps from hundreds of meters away. But as fantastical as the rumors were, they reflected a simple truth. The Canadians' patience and precision defied normal expectations. The ultimate proof of their impact came from captured German intelligence documents. Analysts studying casualty patterns noticed startling anomalies. In areas where British troops fought, German officers made up about 12% of total casualties. In American sectors, officer losses hovered near 15%. But where Canadian troops operated, officer deaths skyrocketed to nearly 38%. Even more astonishing, most of these deaths occurred at ranges beyond 600 meters, distances that, under ordinary conditions, were considered impractical or impossible for consistent accuracy. The psychological effect was immense. German units entering Canadian zones began acting differently within days. They crouched constantly, even behind the front. They refused to stand near exposed windows. They avoided using binoculars altogether. They wore helmets everywhere, even in bed. Patrol numbers dropped dramatically, and soldiers often resisted reconnaissance missions unless forced by their officers. Veterans instructed new arrivals to never assume they were safe, never linger in the open, and never trust fog or silence. One German soldier captured near Casino described an ordeal that sounded unbelievable. His squad had been trapped inside a farmhouse for 2 days by a single sniper they never spotted. Their sergeant fell early on, shot through thick morning fog. Hours later, another man was hit while running toward their radio. In the afternoon, their corporal was killed while taking cover behind a stone wall that should have protected him. The private claimed the bullet must have curved, something he knew was impossible, but after seeing his corporal collapse, he had no other explanation. This fear spread like an epidemic. German troops began firing at shadows, wasting ammunition on rustling bushes or abandoned structures. They reported sniper positions that didn't exist. Even when no Canadians were present, German units behaved as though snipers surrounded them. The fear itself had become a weapon. When Canadian forces moved deeper into Italy and then France, their reputation was so notorious that some German companies requested transfers rather than face them. Others fortified their observation posts with thick layers of sandbags, only to discover that Canadian marksmen still managed to exploit tiny gaps in the defences. Even German counter-sniper teams, some of whom had survived brutal fighting in the Soviet Union, found themselves overwhelmed. They were used to duels at moderate ranges, firing repeatedly until one side gained the upper hand. Against the Canadians, they found nothing to shoot at, only silence, fog, and sudden death. German commanders began issuing unusual orders. Troops were instructed to crawl between buildings rather than walk upright. They were told to avoid using binoculars unless absolutely necessary. During foggy mornings, entire platoons remained motionless, huddled inside basements or behind thick stone walls. Men who had fought on the Eastern Front, who had survived tanks, artillery, and starvation, now feared stepping outdoors because a Canadian they had never seen might be watching them. The myths became more elaborate as morale fell. Some soldiers claimed the Canadians had rifles made from special metals that never rusted. Others insisted they used scopes designed by British scientists capable of seeing through fog. A few believed Canadian bullets were coated with something that made them glide silently through the air. But the truth remained the same. The Canadians were simply better trained, better prepared, and more patient than anyone expected. This psychological dominance was visible in the growing catalogue of German diaries and reports recovered after battles. Accounts described units where men refused to attend to wounded comrades because the area was watched by a sniper. Patrols cancelled themselves because soldiers were too terrified to move. Junior officers hesitated to issue orders that required exposure. Even mundane tasks like fetching water or retrieving supplies became life-threatening challenges. A Canadian sniper could disrupt an entire company by firing a single bullet, and often that single bullet was enough. By the final year of the war, the German High Command was receiving increasingly unusual reports from the Italian and French fronts. Analysts reviewing casualty patterns noticed that units facing Canadians consistently reported higher psychological breakdowns, disrupted patrol schedules, and unusual levels of officer losses. The fog-filled mornings of Italy and the hedgerows of Normandy had become hunting grounds for Canadian snipers who operated with a discipline no one else could replicate. Captured documents revealed that German units in Canadian sectors developed strange rituals. Men waited for the fog to burn off before moving. They crawled instead of walked. They kept helmets on, even while sleeping. Some platoons refused to man observation posts unless directly ordered, and even then they did so with reluctance. German officers began requesting transfers away from areas where Canadian sniper teams were active, citing abnormal losses and impossible shooting conditions. One particularly dramatic account came from a German lieutenant captured near Frosinone. He described how his company had been immobilized for nearly 2 days because of a Canadian shooter hidden somewhere across the valley. The sniper killed their sergeant through dense fog, struck another man reaching for a radio, and later shot a corporal hiding behind a stone wall that should have provided complete protection. The lieutenant insisted the bullet must have changed direction. He knew that wasn't physically possible, but he couldn't understand how else the man died. His story was typical of what many German prisoners described. Not knowing where the shot came from was worse than the danger itself. These effects were exactly what Marshall had envisioned. Canadian sniper teams created an atmosphere of paranoia so intense that German units began imagining threats everywhere. They fired into bushes. They wasted rounds at abandoned barns. They misidentified shadows as enemy movement. Sometimes the Canadians didn't even need to be present. The fear of them was enough to freeze enemy activity. By mid-1944, the Germans were desperately trying to adapt. Some divisions attempted to create their own long-range shooting schools. They imported experienced snipers from the Eastern Front and supplied them with top-tier optics. They built fortified sniper nests with multiple firing slits and escape tunnels. But none of it provided the decisive factor Canadian marksmen had mastered: patience. German doctrine valued aggression and measurable results. Their snipers were expected to deliver continuous pressure. Canadian snipers fired only when conditions were perfect, even if they waited days for that moment. The result was inevitable. German counter-snipers revealed themselves first, frustrated by inactivity, and when they did, they died. The legend of the Canadian Ghost spread faster than any official report. Rumours circulated in German trenches that Canadians had rifles capable of firing silently or bullets guided by unknown technology. Some soldiers believed the Canadians could see through fog or fire through solid stone. Others claimed Canadian sharpshooters were using mystical knowledge from indigenous hunters of the far north. The strangest stories, whispered after too much schnapps, suggested that Canadian snipers had made bargains with ancient spirits in the forests of Manitoba, trading something precious for supernatural accuracy. The truth, however, was more unsettling than any supernatural tale. Canadian snipers were simply men who had mastered their craft to a level that exceeded normal human expectations. Their rifles were ordinary. Their bullets obeyed the laws of physics. But their training, discipline, and extreme patience allowed them to perform feats that seemed impossible to those who suffered under their aim. After the war ended in May 1945, the Canadian sniper doctrine didn't fade. British and American officers, astonished by the results, requested access to Canadian training notes. They wanted to understand how such a small force had produced snipers who terrified one of the world's most seasoned armies. The Canadians shared everything: the patience philosophy, the wind-reading charts, the detailed logbooks. Many of Marshall's and Wallace's techniques became the foundation of modern sniper training across NATO armies. By the outbreak of the Korean War, the Canadian methods had spread worldwide. The one shot, one kill philosophy replaced the older focus on volume of fire. Training shifted to emphasize concealment, discipline, and precise marksmanship. Snipers were no longer treated as simple scouts, but as strategic assets capable of shaping entire battles. A well-trained sniper pair could hold down a mountain pass or a city street, forcing enemy units to alter their plans or accept heavy casualties trying to carry them out. The psychological component, instilling fear through invisibility, became standard doctrine taught in military academies. Marshall himself avoided the spotlight. Returning to Manitoba in late 1945, he slipped back into civilian life, guiding hunting trips and living quietly with his family. Most people in his town knew he'd served in the war, but few knew the extent of his actions. He didn't attend reunions or boast in bars. When asked about his service, he'd just say he was a scout and change the subject. His wife, Margaret, learned only fragments, mostly from the nightmares that shook him awake at night. He never spoke of the actual number of kills. In early 1946, he burned his wartime logbook in their wood stove, letting the pages curl into ash. The government awarded him the Military Medal for bravery. The citation mentioned exceptional performance under fire and exemplary reconnaissance skills. It said nothing about the more than 80 confirmed kills attributed to him, nor about the large bounty German intelligence placed on his capture, nor about the German units that requested transfers to escape his sector. Those details remained classified for decades. Corporal James Wallace took a different path. He stayed in the military, becoming an instructor at Canadian sniper schools. Over the next 20 years, he trained thousands of soldiers who carried the Canadian doctrine into Korea, Vietnam, and numerous smaller conflicts. Wallace was patient with students who struggled. He understood that not everyone was suited for the mental demands of sniping. You couldn't teach a man to lie motionless for 10 hours or ignore hunger, cold, and boredom. Some had the temperament, others didn't. The soldiers Wallace trained would go on to shape sniper warfare across the world. They adapted his and Marshall's methods to deserts, jungles, and mountains. The fundamentals: patience, precision, discipline never changed. Modern rifles and optics improved the maximum ranges, but the mental core remained exactly what Marshall had taught in those cold Italian valleys. Marshall passed away in 1987 at age 76. His obituary in the Winnipeg Free Press was modest. It noted his wartime service, his years as a hunting guide, his family, his love of fishing, and his fiddle playing at local dances. Nowhere did it mention that he had changed military history. By then, most of the German soldiers who feared his name were old men scattered across Europe, waking occasionally at night remembering the fog, the silence, and the sudden inexplicable deaths. In later decades, historians uncovered German intelligence reports detailing impossible shots and supernatural accuracy. Interviews with veterans from both sides confirmed the legends were true, just not magical. Canadian sniper teams had some of the highest kill-to-casualty ratios of any unit in the Second World War. Their effect on German morale was profound and measurable. Modern special forces still train using principles born on those frozen hills. They study wind patterns, terrain, weather, and the art of waiting. They practice becoming part of the environment, holding still until their muscles burn. They learn that sniping isn't about pulling a trigger, it's about patience, discipline, and timing. What German soldiers faced in Italy and France wasn't sorcery. It was something older and more primal. Ancient hunting skills refined with scientific precision. Marshall and Wallace were not magicians. They were hunters in the purest sense. They read the land the way their ancestors had for thousands of years. They mastered patience at a level few humans ever approach. They became extensions of their rifles, living instruments designed for a single perfect moment. The real lesson of their story isn't about technology or tactics. It's about fear, how it shapes men, how it spreads, and how it can destroy morale faster than bullets. The Germans weren't terrified because Canadian weapons were superior. They were terrified because they couldn't understand the enemy they faced. They couldn't see him. They couldn't hear him. They couldn't fight him with the methods they knew. In an age of drones, satellites, and precision-guided weapons, it's haunting to remember that one of the most feared entities in modern warfare was a single man lying silently in the mud, waiting with unbreakable patience for a target who would never see him. Sometimes the oldest skills are still the deadliest. Sometimes one perfectly placed bullet is more powerful than 1,000 fired blindly. And sometimes the most terrifying force on any battlefield isn't a machine or a weapon. It's a human being who has mastered the art of waiting.